Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Carbon Neutral Travel, the what, the how, and the why, presented by Nat Hab's Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel and Expedition Leader, Dr. Court Whelan. It's wonderful to see you again, Court. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Kendall, thank you so much, and greetings, everyone. It's been a bit since I've been on the Daily Dose, and I'm thrilled to be back. It's been several months, but certainly one of the topics that's very near and dear to my heart is this idea of carbon neutrality in travel, or really just kind of the effect of carbon in travel and vice versa. So today is a pretty big deep dive into all things in that relationship. Of course, travel emits carbon, but there are some solutions there, and there's some bigger picture stuff that I want to talk about. So we kind of named it the what, how, and why in no particular order, but we're gonna be covering pretty much everything from start to finish. And of course, I always love the questions, because that's when sometimes the most interesting topics come up, the things that you are most interested or passionate about, and I would definitely like to leave some time for that at the end. So without further ado, let's get into this idea of carbon neutrality in travel. And I will say, spoiler alert, Natural Habitat Adventures is the world's first carbon neutral travel company, so that's kind of part of the things we're gonna weave into it, is the journey that we've been on becoming carbon neutral and maintaining that status throughout many years, and essentially what the effects are, why do we do it, how do we do it, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you know, as the title says. So the first thing I like to throw out there is the general equation for carbon. No, I'm kidding. This is my little joke. I don't even know what the equation this is. I think it's truly an unsolvable equation, but nevertheless, carbon neutrality is not unsolvable. It's a thing that's relatively straightforward, and it's gonna take me just 45 minutes or so to explain. So it's not as complicated as this thing here. But in reality, to kind of step back from all this, one of the things I really want to start off with is this idea that everything we do on the planet has some sort of footprint. It has a footprint from the carbon standpoint, a footprint just as far as literal and metaphorical footprints are. This comes down to agriculture and our relationship with biodiversity and forests and marine ecosystems and in the houses we live in. So this is something that's kind of here to stay. We can't just remove all impact. We can't just remove all effects of our lives on Earth, because we are here to stay. We are inhabitants of this Earth. The trick is minimizing the negative impacts, but also when we talk about travel being woven into this idea, is maximizing the positive impact. So this is a big thing, and this is not really a conservation travel talk per se. I have other of those I've done in the past and I'll continue to do in the future, but I do think this actually plays a big part in this idea of the relationship between carbon emissions and travel, is that you have to minimize negative impact, not just for emissions, but in general, and then you have to maximize the positive impact. So conservation travel is a thing that we subscribe to. It's a thing that we have helped pioneer. It's a form of ecotourism. It's basically sustainable travel that supports the protection of nature, wildlife, and local communities. And again, I'm not going to get a whole lot into that, but the idea is when we talk about emissions in travel, there's nothing we can do to completely absolve ourselves of all impacts in the world of travel, but we can increasingly get more and more involved into the good that travel does for the world. It supports local communities, it invests in local economies, it gets people out of poverty, it gets people educations and healthcare that they may never have otherwise had access to. So there's a big positive part of it, but again, that's not so much the talk, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it at the start of a sustainably minded presentation. What we're really talking about today is this little thing, this CO2 molecule, and the impacts that it's had on Earth and how we can reduce those impacts. This idea of carbon and carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sometimes you'll see the terminology actually is written as like CO2 superscript E minus, and that stands for carbon dioxide equivalents, because there's a few other chemicals, nitrous oxide and various forms of carbon that goes beyond just CO2 or CO. There's methane and so on and so forth. So it's all kind of boiled down into this carbon equivalent. But the thing is that we should not really be too scared of this word carbon dioxide. We shouldn't villainize this idea of carbon, because it actually has a very, very natural role in the ecosystem. And I like to use this graphic here because it's as simple as someone in elementary school could draw on a piece of paper. It's basically the idea that there's this carbon cycle, and carbon is continually being released from the soil and from trees and being absorbed from trees and so on and so forth. It has this big cycle that is constantly getting into the atmosphere and out of the atmosphere, and it's been like that for millennia. I mean, truly, for hundreds of millions of years, it's been a relatively normal cycle. There's been slight upticks and slight downticks. The big issue right now is it's a very, very humanized, anthropocentric issue. What we're doing is we're basically digging deep down into the earth, touching the fossil beds where fossil fuels are, that is quite literally fossilized or very ancient compacted like plants and animals way down in the earth that basically were these plants and animals were alive in the Carboniferous period about 300-400 million years ago, and that intense amount of time and pressure below the Earth's surface and the decay has turned it into just very, very energy rich carbon molecules. Remember, carbon is just ubiquitous in our atmosphere and it's in everything. We are a lot of carbon in our bodies and in things we eat and things we're looking at outside our window right now. But when that turns into very concentrated sources, it's essentially the oil that we talk about. So we're digging it out of the ground and we're finding all sorts of uses for it, and we're burning it to release it into the atmosphere at rates that really are unprecedented, in terms of the long history of life on Earth, hundreds of millions and billions of years. So what happens is we're kind of upsetting this cycle. The world is not able to sequester it at the same rate that we are digging down into the earth that would never otherwise had access to the Earth's air. And we're burning it, which is about the most rapid transition into aerosol carbon and carbon dioxide. So that's the issue, is we're kind of exacerbating this problem. So I think it's our responsibility to figure out solutions. Well, we'll get there in a second. So carbon dioxide is not naturally a bad chemical or a bad element or bad compound. What is going on is it's very, very prominent in the atmosphere, and it's redirecting and re-radiating heat from the sun and gets trapped in this greenhouse effect. This is probably nothing new to you guys, but I had to say this. We're kind of doing a deep dive. This is the overview part. This immense amount of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. It's reflecting and redirecting light and heat, and it's warming the surface of the earth. And of course, this is also not the time to go totally into climate science and climate change terminology, but it heats up and then there's more variable weather. So we get more extreme colds, more extreme hot times, and it kind of just goes in this whole very messed up situation. But really the worst part about it is that we have this idea of a feedback loop. So the elevated carbon that is increasing the Earth's temperature by very small fractions of a degree, at a time or over a year or even over a decade, it's not that itself is the reason that things are warming or becoming more variable. As you get small changes in the atmosphere, again, you're dealing with an Earth that's been able to stabilize itself for hundreds of millions of years, and it's used to very slow, methodical, very small, minute changes, and it stabilizes itself over the course of thousands of years. We as humans don't have thousands of years to wait, and what's worse is that this feedback cycle going on, as temperatures warm and areas dry out, you get more fires. This is a very, very common topic these days. More fires do a couple things. They release more carbon into the atmosphere, worsening the situation, and they also destroy more trees. Trees, as you're going to learn in a little bit, is one of the best things we have to sequester carbon, to actually offset carbon emissions. So this does a problem twofold. It actually, well, in the immediate area, it warms things up, but on a cosmic global level, it warms things up just by the carbon dioxide being emitted. And then it's actually removing that great carbon removal source, trees, at the same time. In addition, as things warm, as the globe warms, we have permafrost in the polar regions that melts, and permafrost, which is basically permanently frozen soil, is actually a very, very strong methane sink. And what I mean by that is it stores methane, just like all the carboniferous oil was a carbon sink way below, protected from the Earth's surface. So is methane in permafrost. Methane is multiple times more of a greenhouse gas than carbon. So when permafrost melts and huge chunks of cliffs fall off, this is just a very dramatic example, methane is released in the atmosphere, which is a carbon dioxide equivalent. But again, it's much, much worse than that. So this starts to release more atmosphere, it starts to warm up, more permafrost starts to melt, releases more methane, starts to warm up, more permafrost melts. It's, again, this feedback cycle that's the most dangerous. In addition, the very common thing we've seen here is the polar ice caps melting, less snow at the North Pole and South Pole. This snow, this ice that surrounds us, we're talking about many, many, many square miles. This actually reflects heat from the surface of the ocean, reflects heat from the surface of the earth, and sends it back up in basically the atmosphere and into outer space if all things go well. Now, as there's less and less ice, you have a deep, dark blue ocean. This dark blue ocean, as you can tell if you've ever worn a black t-shirt out in a hot day, or a black ball cap, you notice it actually absorbs more heat and gets hotter. So a dark blue ocean opposed to nice reflective white snow or ice actually absorbs more heat. So the ocean becomes warmer. More and more feedback cycle stuff. Then you start to mess with the water cycle, which is not good. You don't want to mess with the water cycle. You can mess with anything else out there, but don't mess with the water cycle, because once you mess with this, you have even more feedback cycle. Higher water vapor concentrations trap more heat. Higher water temperatures increase evaporation. More evaporation leads to more water vapor, and so on and so forth. And then there's all these other things like what happens to our ability to get fresh water from rain collection, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, none of this is going to happen in the next couple months or a couple years, but we're forecasting, we're predicting what might be happening as temperatures warm, and we are seeing evidence of this. And we are going towards a sort of dangerous route here. So what we need to do is we need to figure out a way to get it out of the atmosphere. It's not as easy as just catching it with a net. It's really relatively complex. We are going to get into that in a second, but one of the most powerful things you can do as an individual, we as global citizens, is understand a little bit about where your own carbon emissions might be coming from. And the best way to do so is to kind of do a little bit of your own diving into it, joining webinars like this, looking online. These are just a few examples. They're not all like this. You can get wildly different swings on what your own household energy use might be. In a few slides, I'm actually going to give you a really cool link to calculate your annual carbon footprint. It's like a really elegant system. It's actually kind of fun in a weird way. But nevertheless, it's not like carbon is just coming from your car and that's it. It's not like it's just coming from the airplane where you fly to visit relatives or go on vacation and that's it. It's coming from a lot of different sources. Now, I definitely don't expect or want you to memorize all this stuff. Just know that it comes from a lot of different places. The chart that I refer to most is kind of a bigger cosmic scale, global scale greenhouse gas emission pie chart. And this is where I'm gonna spend a couple more minutes talking about. So if we look here, let's go towards travel and tourism right off the bat. So transportation is a relatively large bucket. 14% of all global greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. That's split about halvesies with trade and commerce and tourism, or travel for the sake of tourism, travel for the sake of travel. So we in the travel industry, we're looking at about 7 to 8% of contribution to the overall pie chart here. Now, one of the things I often say is that, that's not the biggest slice whatsoever, but it is a slice indeed. So we have to absolutely address it head on. We have to think about how we can create solutions for it. But I also say that there's been a lot of things in the last few years of looking at travel as almost villainizing in a way that like, well, you should stop flying because flying is one of the big contributors. It is a contributor, but as you'll see here, there are other really big pieces of the pie. And I do view, when we look at conservation travel and the inspiration and influence we have in the travel industry to spread knowledge about our natural world, to create ambassadors and advocates for saving biodiversity and rainforests and coral reef, get people into places where they can fall in love with these things, it actually has an immense power for good. And I think it might be one of our more powerful tools to help shape and influence the rest of these industries that also contribute double-digit percentages of global greenhouse gas emissions. But we'll come back to that idea in a second. But we're looking at, agriculture, electricity and heat production, the biggest slice of the pie is indeed heat production and electricity. That's kind of obvious. We have an affinity towards living in relatively cold environments. So a lot of heat is produced from oil, from electricity, and that of course creates kind of scope 1 and scope 2 global greenhouse gas emissions, either direct or indirect. So anyway, we'll move on from this because I really want to kind of come back to the core of this presentation, which is talking about how travel plays a part in this overall emissions spectrum and how carbon neutral travel happens. So again, planes, boats, trains, automobiles, all that sort of stuff, it all contributes. They have different emission factors, of course. Some things are more sustainable, some things are relatively unavoidable. You can't really go on an African safari by bus or by boat. You've got to fly to get there. So first and foremost, I'll put this out there. This is a very key message, is that when we talk about saving the world, conservation travel, and addressing carbon emissions, the first thing is to look at how can you reduce those emissions. I mean, that's the first thing. The idea of offsetting those emissions, as we'll talk about for most of the remainder of this presentation, is a great solution for when you can't reduce those emissions. But whatever industry you might be in, or we might be talking about on a given day, whether it's heating, agriculture, other things, reducing emissions is probably the best tactic. We can't completely solve the problem by offsetting it, but there are certain industries, there are certain behaviors that we are relatively beholden to get from place to place. And while we would love to use, electric 747 planes to get across oceans, we still haven't gotten there. I will say there's some really cool things coming out with sustainable aviation fuel, sustainable marine diesel oil that is, basically halving the amount of emissions that one vehicle or boat might produce over a less sustainable type of fuel. So there are major ways of progressing, but we at Natural Habitat and you as travelers, you don't have a lot of ability to, check a box on your flight request form to take an electric plane to where you're going. So as a result, we back in 2007 decided, well, one of the best things we can do when we can't reduce emissions is we are going to offset those emissions for everything that is involved in our trips themselves. This goes from the moment you land on the ground, all throughout your safari, all the land cruisers that you're rumbling around on, any sort of internal flights and boats and so on and so forth. Spoiler alert, I will say in a few slides that we have since upped the ante, and we now as a company offset all international and domestic flights, no matter where in the world you're coming from, to get to the starting point and get home from the ending point of the trip. But nevertheless, we started with just offsetting everything on the trips themselves and grew from there. But the general idea of what carbon offsetting is, it is balancing your emissions and finding a way to somehow offset it with a number of projects that I'll go into here in a second. So the first part of the equation is essentially calculating all of your emissions. We do so at Natural Habitat on a per person, per trip basis, and this is something that I personally oversee, and I do calculations each and every year on these exact things. So on an individual basis, what is the per capita emissions for our polar bear trips, or for our Botswana safaris, or our Alaska safaris, India for tigers? They all are quite different. We're not just putting a blanket number out there and guessing. We get into really, really meticulous numbers in detail, which I will show in just a second. But again, then we're balancing it out by purchasing carbon offsets, which does something to minimize or remove carbon from the atmosphere. So it's this balancing act where the offsets balance out from the emissions. It's kind of like a one-to-one equivalency. So when it comes down to crunching the numbers, this is again me. I work with our data team. I work with our operations team to really look at what is the emission factor per trip. How many travelers do we have on the trip? What sort of vehicles are we looking at? And essentially what I'm doing is I'm going through one by one, line item by line item, each day of an itinerary, and I'm saying, okay, so this bus or this vehicle is picking up on average this many people from the airport and driving them, say 20 miles to the hotel or 10 miles to the airport hotel that we're checking in on for day one. That's a 14 mile gallon per vehicle. So on average, that's looking at 0.01 metric tons or something like that. There are a lot of calculators online that I use. And like I said, I will show you a link for calculators here in a second that you can use on your own time if you're interested in learning more about that. So what I do is each year I go through every single new itinerary and I create a per person emission value. The great thing, because of a lot of what we do is we do very similar itineraries from year over year, or if they do change, we're changing maybe a new safari camp, or we're maybe going to a new park, or adding a park, or we're adding a day or taking a day away from an itinerary. It's not like we're doing custom trips all the time where I have to do this for all 700 or 800 trips a year. That would be a lot. But when we do add a new itinerary, 3 or 4 or 5 new itineraries a year, I will go through meticulously and figure out exactly what that per person emission spectrum is on the trip by trip basis. And then I put all sorts of fun spreadsheets in the computer, and I figure out this entirely, or like this totality number of not just all the trips and all of our guests, but also all the flights now, like I was talking about. There's great calculators online that allow me to do that. And then I check out our building energy use. We've even started offsetting staff commute hours and commute time for getting from their homes to the office, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite thorough. So I get this big number, and we're looking at that balancing equation here. I have this total number, and I have a total number of metric tons. Then what I do is I work with a carbon offsetting company on investing in usually about 3 projects a year. In one of our most recent suite of 3 projects, these are all great examples of the kind of stuff that we're looking at, is reforestation in Zimbabwe, wind energy in India, in hyper-efficient cook stoves in Rwanda. And let me spend a little bit of time on this page because we definitely want to get you information on how this all works. And if you want to dive deeper, I do have that link at the bottom that talks more about this stuff too. But basically, you have three main categories of offsets, which are represented here. I always try to pick from one of three or one of each category each year as I'm doing these offsets. So the first one is reforestation. So that's basically planting trees, or it's forest conservation. It's making sure trees stay standing up in forest, and it's basically the idea of carbon sequestration. Trees breathe carbon dioxide, so you can actually have a very specific value per tree, per acre of forest of how much it draws in from the atmosphere per unit time, right? So carbon sequestration, it draws carbon from the atmosphere. If you add trees to a forest or you create a new protected area, we're talking, we're not talking about like 10 trees for a year's worth of our carbon offsets. We're talking about, many hectares, square miles, like massive tracts of land. You can actually get a solid value from that forest. The middle bucket here is sustainable energy, green energy, and this kind of is an obvious one. Basically, what you're doing is you're providing energy in a way that doesn't have to be burning coal or fossil fuels. And then the last one is probably the most unique. It's the most abstract concept, but it's kind of my favorite way to do carbon offsets. It's usually more expensive. It's usually harder to find these projects. It's harder to start these projects. But the idea is what you can do is you can provide ways for remote villages to reduce their own carbon footprint that they may otherwise not have been able to do. So cook stoves is a great way to do it. So a cook stove, you can see these little buckets. These are much more efficient than the cook stoves that the village would normally be using by the tune of about 50 to 80%. Okay, so that means if we did not invest in new cook stoves, this village would be burning, X number of metric tons of carbon a year just to boil their water, to cook their food, et cetera, et cetera. We come in and we replace those stoves with something better. It takes less wood or minimal wood or no wood at all. Sometimes it's actually propane or biodiesel based. And essentially what you can do is by understanding the emission factor of the stove versus the emission factor of the original cook stove, you can say, well, this investment of money reduced this village's carbon footprint by X number of metric tons per year. Now, I will say right off the bat that we don't do those calculations. That is all by these third-party auditor firms that help make sure when we say we're offsetting a metric ton or 10 metric tons or 1,000 metric tons to this project, it's actually happening. These are people on the ground doing the measurements. These are, they're actually taking atmospheric data, they're doing tests in labs, and they're making sure this is indeed exactly what's happening. So these third-party auditor firms have been a really big addition to the carbon offset scene in the last 10 years. And I'll talk a little bit more about those guys. But before I get into that, our offset company, they're called South Pole. We've been working with them for a number of years now, and they're fantastic. Very Googleable. It is just southpole.com. And believe it or not, you can actually purchase offsets from them directly. Anybody can purchase an offset. The price is extremely variable depending on the project, the region, the quantity. But these guys are fantastic. These are the actual project implementers. So they're the ones that say, if we go in and we provide 10,000 cook stoves to this region in Rwanda, we think we can have a major impact. Let's hire these third-party auditors that do the testing to test the difference in efficiency, and then we sort of do the legwork to provide the cook stoves. We source them, we train the folks, we train them in how to repair the cook stoves, and we provide new ones once they're inoperable anymore. And then we will go to the market, the carbon offset market, which is basically like Nat Hab and other companies that want to purchase those offsets, and they sell them to us sort of in this per metric ton base. So it's a really integral part of the equation. I want to say like a carbon offset broker, but that kind of had like a not so great tone to it. But it's essentially what they're doing. They're designing the projects, they're implementing them, they're making sure that they are legit and do what they say they're doing, and then they make it easy for companies like us or individuals like you to actually purchase them and ensure validity. So getting into some of the details, this is really cool. Since 2007, I told you that's when we officially went carbon neutral. We have offset 110 million pounds of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. Remember I was saying sometimes it's methane, sometimes it's other things, but carbon dioxide equivalent is what we usually talk about. Now these rows here are sort of the fun factor. This is we didn't actually do any of this stuff below, but it is the equivalent. If we were to offset 110 million pounds of CO2, it's the equivalent of any number of one of these things happening. And you know, it's just a fun way, it's an understandable way to know what the impact is. My favorite one is actually on the bottom here, is the amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere is equivalent to about 2.1 million trash bags of waste recycled instead of landfilled. Again, these are all equivalents according to the EPA. So when it comes to carbon offsetting, it hasn't had, you know, it has had its fair share of controversy over the years. But fortunately, in present day, most of these things have been lessened significantly. One of the major things from, you know, let's say 20 years ago, when carbon offset was a very, very early term, and you hear carbon credits and the voluntary carbon market and blah, 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 and all this stuff. There's a lot of sort of rhetoric and a lot of, you know, debates going back and forth. One of the initial things is indeed the validity. When you are purchasing a metric ton, are you actually absorbing that from the atmosphere, or actually preventing it from getting the atmosphere in the first place? And before these third-party auditors came in, there was a question, you know, like, well, are the folks that you're actually purchasing the offsets from, is it in their best interest to measure these things, spend more money to do the measuring? So again, adding in the third-party auditors has been a really, really significant thing. The other controversy, which is still in place, and I'm just telling you just because of full transparency, but the other thing that's still in place is a lot of these carbon offset projects have to do with investing in foreign countries, especially with renewable energy. You saw that we actually invest in wind energy in India. And the persistent kind of question is, well, if you're investing in a government project to, you know, formulate or to install green energy, shouldn't it actually be that foreign government's business to do that? Like, are you just keeping money in their bank accounts by injecting foreign investment? Shouldn't they be using their own funds to do it? And I say, yeah, it's kind of a valid point. I get it. I see where you're coming from. Yeah, it'd be nice if they did that, but they're not. You know, they may not have the money to invest in the solar project, the wind project, the hydro project, et cetera, et cetera. So I get that, and that's something that kind of comes down to a way more level of nitty gritty than we can be involved in. But nevertheless, we want to do the most good. So I think investing in sustainable energy and maybe making it easier for the government to invest once the project is already in place is nothing but just a really good thing. So what is the future for carbon offsetting as it pertains to the travel industry, as it pertains to carbon offsetting in general? Well, like I said, one of the main things that we are always after as a travel company, and as you know, I will humbly say one of the world's most sustainable eco-travel companies, is more offsetting. So like I said, back in 2018, we started offsetting not just the trips themselves, not just our offices and, you know, our brochure printing and all that sort of tangible and intangible stuff, but we started offsetting flights, international and domestic flights. The origin of not doing that did partially come down to finances. Carbon offsets have become more affordable, more accessible. But we also thought in the very beginning, we should actually put some responsibility on the part of the traveler, right? And we should make it so easy for the traveler to be involved in that, but they may want to have some skin in the game. They may want to purchase the offsets themselves. So we went through a lot of different iterations of that. We continue to make it easier and easier for guests to offset their own flights. Quite literally, it came down to just pushing a button on their invoice or telling their salesperson or contacting the office, yes, please sign me up for that. But we noticed is that it was just kind of getting overlooked, and we really never got any significant buy-in. So as we worked more and more in the offsetting industry, and we found, you know, more and more projects at better and better efficacy, better and better rates, we're saying, you know, finally, I think we should just go ahead and do this for all of our travelers across the board. We will offset every single flight from every single traveler, no matter where in the world they're coming from. And just to give you an idea of the impact of that, nowadays, the international and domestic flight to get people to and from locations accounts for about 75% of our offsetting budget and our total metric tonnage. So it's a significant portion of offsetting is actually just the main flight to and from. I mentioned I would show you this really nifty calculator. There are many calculators online. If you have a few moments this afternoon, you can always just Google carbon offset calculators, and you'll see, you know, 10 of them just on the first page of Google. This is one I highly recommend navigating to. It's a very elegant and very thorough and very interesting and sort of fun way to, in real time, as you add these things to your carbon offset picture, through the University of California, Berkeley, you can actually see where your metric tonnage is per year. And what you'll notice is just right up here, this 48, that's, you know, that's whatever input I plugged in, just as an example, that's the equivalent of 48 metric tons per year. The average American is at about 40. Okay, so if you do this experiment on your own and navigate to this and play around and see where you stand in terms of the average American. Some people are a little bit more, some people a little bit less. You might drive an e-vehicle, or maybe you own a second vacation home, you're a little bit more because of the footprint there, et cetera, et cetera. But it's worth toying around with this and just knowing that it exists. Now, the way I stumbled upon this is a couple of years ago, we had a series of trips, and we're planning to continue these into the future as we sort of continue to emerge and rebound out of COVID, is climate conscious trips around the world. We did our first one up to the Arctic to see polar bears. We've done one with how climate affects whale migrations in Baja. And for every single traveler that joined one of those trips, this is cool. For every single traveler that joined one of those trips, Natural Habitat offset their lives for a year. And that's just the coolest thing. So what we would do for those travelers, we would email them a link to this calculator. They would tell us what their total yearly metric tonnage is, and we would add that to our overall year tally, year total. And then, if they didn't get back to us, we would estimate well beyond what the average, like 1.5 times the average American's rate, just to be safe. And it's a really cool thing. We're going to try to do more of that. We're going to try to hone that process. I think it's cool that we're doing it, but the thing I really want to happen is to empower people to look into this a little bit more in their own lives and understand a little bit about, what does move the needle most. As you go through these tabs at the top of getting started and travel and home and food and shopping, where does your total boost the most? If you have a slightly larger house, or if you have more people living in the house and therefore the per capita is a little bit lower. I want to get people just aware of this, because I think that's a great way to create a conservation culture around carbon emissions. Another big thing that we want to do is we want to influence the industry, and we are very happy to be able to do so. We have influenced, so we were the world's first carbon neutral travel company. And I don't want to take total credit for JetBlue Airways going carbon neutral recently, but shouldn't we? I mean, shouldn't we, right? I can't hear you, but I'm sure you're saying yes. No, I'm kidding. But I think what it is you can only do what you can do, and everything that we're doing is truly kind of dropping the bucket. We're looking at, on a worldwide basis, about 43 billion metric tons of carbon being emitted each year. And even though we're in the thousands and tens of thousands as a business that we're offsetting, and there are many, many, many others that are offsetting as well in other industries and other travel businesses, the idea is to continue that influence, to have the ripple effect, to have the cascading dominoes, so to speak, and have more and more travel companies, more and more other industries join in. So remember that original pie chart that I showed, we can start to influence agriculture and heating and energy use and industry and other travel, not just tourism, but maybe how other travel and trade happens. So it's been great working with partners at Lindblad Expeditions and Off the Beaten Path and Duvine and Adventure Travel Trade Association to indeed work on carbon neutrality solutions in their respective travel company space. And there's even other airlines that are getting on board. United Airlines has a great option to just click, again, an easy button to offset all of your flights, and they invest in carbon offsetting themselves. Delta is doing a similar thing. In fact, I think Delta has announced that they are going to go fully carbon neutral by a certain year, coming up here pretty soon, joining in JetBlue Airways as being carbon neutral to some degree. So more projects. This is another thing, the future of carbon offsets. This is unfortunately an aerial view, a bird's eye view of Madagascar. Madagascar is one of the more heavily deforested areas in terms of like a per square mile basis on planet Earth, unfortunately. But it doesn't mean we can't reverse this. So what I want to see is I want to see more projects. I want to see more inventive solutions like the cook stove projects. There's another category of projects that actually provides water filters to remote rural villages. And there's actually an emissions equivalent you can attribute to giving a water filter to a village. And what that does is it eliminates the need to create a fire to boil water. It also eliminates the need to go cut down trees or gather firewood in the forest to build that fire, to emit the smoke, to boil the water, to purify to drink. So it cuts all that out of the equation. And again, these people doing the research on the ground will actually give you an equivalent of per water filter you contribute. It actually lessens the overall footprint. It reduces the emissions by X number of metric tons. It's very, very cool. And also, reforestation, it's one of the easier projects we can get involved in. It's one of the less expensive projects. But the thing I love about it is that it not just addresses the carbon issue, not just sequesters carbon from the atmosphere, but it has a great additional benefit of creating jobs for local folks and local villages to monitor the forest, to actually participate in the reforestation program. It creates habitat for wildlife. So there's a lot of good things that can come from all sorts of projects, and I would like to see more and more projects. And the great thing is, truth be told, the carbon offsetting right now in the world is like skyrocketing in the last couple of years. It is amazing how many other companies, not just travel, in fact, it's really the other industries that are jumping on board, because I think of this cascading influence that we're all garnering by banding together to tell the story and to make it easier and more doable to carbon offset. So as a result, there are more projects in more countries and more habitats doing more creative solutions than ever before. It's really, really inspiring. So like I said at the start, you can't look at solving the climate issue and the carbon issue just by putting this very, very big Band-Aid over things. And I'll be the first to say it. You know, I think that carbon offsetting is a very, very big Band-Aid. It's a very effective Band-Aid. It heals wounds. It's that level of Band-Aid. But, you know, we can't completely get by for the next 100 years, 200 years as a society without also figuring out how to reduce our footprint. Now, like I said, we in the travel space, we're beholden to transportation, and you know, we don't own camps, we don't own things all that much. So as a result, we have to work with our partners to get these things out in the field. So reducing our footprint is a huge, huge thing that we're now noticing is gaining a little bit more traction. One of the projects I'm working on right now is looking at acquiring an electric safari vehicle for Africa, and it's an amazing journey that I'm on right now, researching what goes into this, whether it's going to be an on-the-grid style camp or an off-the-grid style camp, the solar array that has to go into it, the transportation, the permitting, et cetera, et cetera. But nevertheless, it's amazing to know that the momentum is definitely there. When it comes to flights, like I said, there's been some really interesting studies out there that show within the last 30 years of aviation, meaning like the newer planes that Boeing and Airbus are coming out with, today versus 30 years ago, they're about 50% more efficient, even with just normal aviation fuel. Even with just normal aviation fuel, about 50% more efficient than 30 years ago, the planes coming out. You add a sustainable aviation fuel beyond that, and it's another big move in the right direction. But what really gets me intrigued is the idea of these smaller regional flights being able to go fully electric. And in the last couple of years, been some really, really cool technologies have emerged in Canada, test flights in Alaska and British Columbia. They're only around 45 minutes apiece, but nevertheless, they have been successful. They're on small little planes like this, like some of the Beavers and the Cub Cadets and little, you know, like kind of 9 to 10-seater planes. But if you've ever been to remote Canada or remote Alaska, you know that there's a lot of this happening in terms of flights, smaller 9 to 12 passenger flights. So getting electric technology up there and then allowing it to take hold and grow maybe to bigger planes, I think is a really, really interesting thing. Carbon removal is a new technology, a newish technology that I think is going to be a really big piece of the puzzle. So essentially what carbon removal is, you know, I say that trees sequester carbon. That's a very organic way to do so. These big kind of air conditioning unit systems are actually drawing, like literally sucking carbon out from the atmosphere and basically turning it into rock that you can put on the ground, in the ground, whatever, safely to actually draw it out from the atmosphere. Now, the only issues with this is that it's a newer technology. It's very expensive. And what it does is it creates a very big barrier to entry for anyone looking to dabble in this or looking to do so, even if they don't have immense budgets for something like this. Just to give you an idea, it's about 200 times more expensive to invest in carbon removal versus carbon offsetting. But nevertheless, we do dabble in this. We try to put part of our portfolio in this just to help them move the needle on increasing technologies, increasing awareness. As more businesses do invest in this, they're only going to become better, more efficient, and that's going to drive the price down, hopefully, to make it more available. And the only other issue with this is, yes, these work really well, and it is like a very final solution, is that, you know, compared to trees and planting a forest, there's something really cool about sequestering carbon the natural way and not just creating a beautiful forest that provides oxygen, but also creates habitat for wildlife. So although I do think this is going to be a very significant piece of the puzzle, and I think this can actually draw carbon out of the atmosphere at a much faster rate, I would not put all my eggs in this basket as the only thing that's going to get us out of this predicament. There are novel solutions out there. One that I find most interesting is actually paying farmers to plant the most efficient carbon sequestration plants in fallow fields. So I don't remember the species that they're planting, but there's a program it's some sort of like little poppy or a smaller plant, but basically in fields that farmers are not actively using to grow soybeans or wheat or what have you, they are being paid to plant these other plants that draw carbon out of the atmosphere at a very, very high level, like much, much faster than anything else that would be grown in similar plots. And these things are popping up all the time. I love these novel solutions, and we will see more in the future. But like I said, one of the biggest things is how can travel influence these other pieces of the pie? Yes, we are 7%, but even if we take travel fully out of the spectrum, that's still 93% of emissions still out there. So I always say that yes, we need to hone our own carbon removal or offsetting or lessening our own emissions in travel. But I think at the same time as lessening our negative impacts, we need to be increasing our positive impacts. And when I look at basically the agriculture and sort of food part of the pie chart, I was alarmed a couple of years ago when we were prepping for our zero waste adventure to find that food waste in general, just the food that never makes it into someone's belly, accounts for about 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This means all the agriculture, all the transportation needed to get to the store, all the cooling or heating needed to cook it or to keep it in refrigeration, all that together for the food that never actually gets eaten is about 11%. So when you compare the 7% of the travel industry or the tourism industry, how can we use that for good? How can we use that to lessen that 11% and actually bring down that? And I think it's very doable. This is something we did significantly on our zero waste adventure, and we're very adamant about rolling this out on other trips and other travel companies. And if you did watch our zero waste adventure webinar, you'll notice that all of our waste, including recyclables and food waste and all that, things that had to go to landfill that couldn't be recycled or composted or refused or reused or TerraCycled, actually fit in one mason jar over the course of the trip. And we really hit food waste head on. And I think it was a pretty alarming and inspiring thing. In addition, there are other things we can do. When we're looking at reducing carbon footprints or addressing them, novel solutions also include things like investing in women empowerment around the world. We've found, not we, but the research community has found that if we empower women around the world in a greater degree, it actually has direct impacts on female-led business ownership in rural nations and villages, and actually decreases their own individual carbon footprints. Actively investing in NGOs to look at climate as it pertains to food, forests, oceans, freshwater, wildlife. Being part of the World Wildlife Fund is so enlightening to get more information out on this. To our guests, we've been part of Travelers Against Plastic. Plastic is a very petroleum-heavy substance. It's great in some ways, but it's not great in others. Not least of which is, of course, the pollution that is caused by straws and plastic water bottles. But it also has a very big dent on the carbon offsetting part if we can remove those from trips. So I'm pleased to say we've been completely plastic water bottle free for about 12 years now. And we've taken drinking straws away from our trips for about the last about 3 years, 2 or 3 years now. And again, just moving the needle in these small ways makes a really, really big impact on how we can be an influence for good, inspire our travelers, inspire other travel companies, and therefore other industries by, again, leading that vanguard of sustainability and creating what I believe to be a conservation culture around sustainability using carbon offsetting as a really big megaphone for change. So with that, I know I've got some great questions out there. I put some links down there below that you might want to have a look at. South Pole, that cool climate calculator, and then of course Nat Hab's conservation page where you can learn more about the programs we're involved in. So anyway, I'll stop there, and I know I've got some great questions from the audience, so thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Court. And I will supply those links in the replay notification email, so in case you guys miss jotting those down. Okay, before we start the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question today, you can submit that in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, first question. Why wouldn't it, or I guess I should say, wouldn't it be better to invest in offsets that are greater than the amount of CO2 generated by the travel?
Yes, yeah, short answer, yes. The more you offset, the better, right? I mean, it's pretty linear. And we thought about that a little while. We're like, okay, so maybe we do 110% of carbon offsets. Maybe we do 115, maybe 120, maybe we just go wild to 200%. And that's great. But I mean, so here's the thing is that, you know, you have sort of a set budget. Even if you can increase that budget, there is a pot that you drop on for any sort of conservation projects, for any sort of sustainability project. And like I keep on saying, a big part of our efficacy in doing carbon offsetting or zero waste trips is that we are a beacon for good. We're leading the way, we're leading the vanguard, and we're kind of looking at the storytelling element of this as pretty integral to, you know, passing the torch on to the next travel company. You know, we're raising the bar on conservation. You'll see that all over our materials. We're raising the bar on conservation to get other people to pay attention to it. And so while it would be very cool and symbolic to do 110% of emissions, would that extra 10%, does that actually just create an arms race with other travel companies? Does that just mean the next year when we have a little bit more budget, we'll do 115%? Or do we take that money and do other really novel things like investing in the world's first zero waste adventure? Or do we say, oh, okay, so for select trips, we're gonna start offsetting people's lives for a year? You know what I mean? So yes, it does good, but I'm personally, and I could, you know, there are arguments for either side. I would personally rather look at that, like whatever that cost to do the 10 or 20% over 100% carbon neutral would be. And I'd like to invest in different projects, different ways of getting us out there. And, you know, honestly, in the end, my greatest goal, probably will be a little bit of time for it to happen, is to offset the lives of all of our travelers. You know, that's the big thing, because I think what it does is it puts ownership to the individual to look at that, to monitor, to understand it, and it makes a really, really big difference. It's a lot about like the end goal of getting people to, you know, listen to all this, digest it, understand it. And so I like to move the needle and sort of spread the wealth as much as possible. I hope that makes sense. But in essence, yes, the more you offset, the better, for sure. But where is that sweet spot? I think the sweet spot is doing like more industry firsts and using those resources to get the word out more.
All right, thanks, Court. So there's someone who's wondering why Nat Hab doesn't support solar cook stoves. Can you talk a little bit more about the cook stove program?
Oh yeah, we do. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so any year I choose about 3 projects, mainly because we do offset a pretty immense volume by a typical business standards. You know, a lot of people are offsetting, you know, their own individual work travel. They might do 2 or 3 work trips a year, and they're offsetting like, you know, 10 metric tons or 20 metric tons a year. We're offsetting like 20,000 metric tons. So we actually have the ability to really make big strides in these projects. So rather than choose like 10 or 20 projects, I try to invest in certain projects in a really, really big way to get them to the point where they need to be. We have invested in solar cook stoves. We have invested in biogas projects. We have invested in those water filter projects. We have invested in solar arrays. We have invested in small sustainable hydro. We have invested in lots of different reforestation programs. So we do. Ultimately, to more directly answer your question, solar cook stoves, although we have invested in things like that, one of the big issues is functionality and the longevity. So we found that hyper efficient cook stoves, which really is just a matter of like encasing the heating element or designing it such that the flame and there's just more what we call complete combustion versus incomplete combustion. It goes to, you know, the same amount of wood heats 4 times as much water to boil or 4 times as much rice to cook. Is the idea is it's inexpensive and it does stuff in a big way, and they don't break down a lot. The retention of these cook stoves over the course of a 10-year period, meaning like without having to repair or replace, is about 95%, which is really darn good. I could see solar cook stoves being pretty good in certain areas and certain places, but I will tell you, just from me very much knowing what projects are out there and which ones gain the most traction, is that solar cook stoves only work in very specific areas where there is a little more connectivity for repairs and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, you're exactly right, and we have done that sort of stuff. So I'm just kind of covering all my bases there. We're just really honing in on those 3 projects just right now, but they change on a year-to-year basis.
Thank you. So someone was really interested in hearing a little bit more about how the carbon removal machine mechanisms work. Are you able to explain a little bit more about that?
Take a deep breath. I don't. I mean, I know enough to be dangerous and to possibly say the wrong thing. Basically, I mean, it's truly sucking in particles from the atmosphere, and there's some sort of like catalytic converter style thing that it's somewhat, you know how like a smokestack works in a factory? It's sort of similar to that in that it's like accumulating the particulate, but I have no idea about like how the filters work and how it takes it out of the air and puts it in the storage container and then continues to suck, and how much power it takes. I don't. I wish I did. If you want to email me or email us directly, I can do a little bit more research. I have some articles on it that I could share. It's mostly witchcraft, I think. It's just
a lot.
it's impressive technology.
There's a lot of really exciting, innovative solutions out there. Yeah. So, and I'm sure we can Google it and find some more information. Another question I'm not sure you'll be able to answer, but I'll ask it anyway. How does the cold affect the electric powered planes in Alaska?
Well, I would imagine significantly. So the planes have been they run in the summer mainly because that's kind of like the main time people get around. Not a lot of planes are flying in January and February, getting people from point to point. I think you probably have more issues with runways being clear because remember a lot of these are like float planes, and you know there might be ice on the ponds or rivers or lakes. So it's definitely a summertime thing. So I doubt they've been really tested very much in the winter. You present a really interesting thought that I haven't really thought of much, is that, you know, is it worth investing in planes that might only have 3 or 4 months of seasons where they can operate? That all being said, I can tell you that batteries are a finicky thing. You know, I'm looking at this solar array of lithium-ion batteries that we might be installing at a camp for electric vehicles, and they're finicky in that they can't be hot or too cold. Too cold means they're just going to get zapped and they're not going to store their energy. Too hot means it's going to lessen their lifespan. So you might get 10 or 15 years out of a great solar array and lithium array, whereas you might only get 4 or 5 or 6 if they get too hot. So the cold, we are all familiar with it because when we take our cameras out on, you know, Northern Lights trips and polar bear trips, they tend to lose their charge a little bit faster. I would imagine it would be an issue, but I just don't think they're really operating because you have bigger issues with aviation in the winter of Alaska, which is just straight up weather and ice and snow and sleet and frozen ponds and lakes that don't make it good for flying.
Right, yeah. Okay, just a couple more questions because we're getting close to the top of the hour here. I believe this next question is referring to South Pole. Who audits the auditors?
Oh, that's a great question. So South Pole does their own auditing, so that's one level. But then if you go on their website, you'll notice every single project is then audited by like the gold standard or VCS or the biodiversity standard. And they're basically like the tax man. Like they're trying to get you. Like they're trying to call South Pole out or try to find issues. You know, beyond that, I think it's a slippery slope. If you have, you know, an auditor of an auditor of an auditor, shouldn't there then be an auditor of an auditor of an auditor? You know, like lot of auditors. It's one or the other. I don't know. You see how it's like it gets pretty complex. My guess is that there's a level at which government bodies and environmental bodies and NGOs have said, okay, when you have 2 or 3 levels of auditing, which is basically what's in place, you have like, so in science, we talk about like 95% confidence intervals, which means that given these numbers and this statistical ratio, you are 95% confident your data is correct. My guess is there's probably some sort of equivalent, like a 95% confidence interval. They're like, okay, we're pretty sure that any project is only going to slightly be over or under by 2.5% when there's 2 levels of auditing or 3 levels of auditing. Just my guess, but it's a great question. I mean, I think that's the kind of scrutiny that we need to have. And I think that that's been relatively solved by having really, really great auditing companies. And honestly, this might be something that does exist that I'm not aware of. Like the gold standard, which is oftentimes one of the most rigorous standards for carbon offsetting, might indeed have more literature on their website about like who might be check and balancing them as well. I have to assume there's something in place.
Mm-hmm. All right, final question. Can you explain again about Nat Hab clients using Cool Climate site and sending that info to Nat Hab?
Yeah, so there were a number of select trips that we had. This is, pre-COVID. I don't believe we're running those for the next year, but we're revisiting them for the year after, where it was a climate conscious departure. So it would have been like the title of your trip. You kind of would know if you were signing up for it. It has like special guest lectures from universities and from World Wildlife Fund talking about climate issues as it relates to the place at hand. And we had sort of like evening lectures and whatnot. For all those trips, we had people either use that calculator and send us their number that they got per year, or we would just make a very, very generous assumption if we just couldn't get a hold of individual travelers to tell us that information. We used, I think, 60 metric tons, which, as you'll see, if you play around with this on your own, it takes a lot to get to 60 metric tons. So we made a very generous assumption there. But my hope is that in the future, and this is about 5 departures that we had, is that in the future we'll do something similar to that, and we will again offer through emails and phone calls and all that for anybody on those departures. Click this link, go to the Cool Climate website and tell us what your number is, and we will offset that for you for the next calendar year. At the moment, like I said, I don't believe we have any of those departures active, but once we all kind of get our feet under us in this sort of COVID era of travel, we definitely will be doing more, because I think it's one of the coolest things out there. It's a really great way to add information and empowerment, understanding for our travelers. I can tell you this: no other travel company is offsetting their travelers' lives for a year, and there's something just inherently cool and fun and very story worthy about that. But it's also it's that ripple effect that, well, if we do that and if we raise the bar, what idea is another travel company going to do that inspires us to then continually raise the bar? So it is like this, it is almost like an arms race, but in all the right ways for all the right reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you're working on a lot of exciting things for the future, Court. So thank you so much for bringing this to our attention today. It is the top of the hour, so I'm going to call it there with the Q&A and hand it back over to you, Court, for closing comments.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you in the audience for joining today. It's been great to be back with you in Daily Dose. It's been a little while. I've got a couple more coming up in the coming months, so we'll be sure to get those out to you. And as always, shoot us a note if you have any other questions on conservation, sustainability. I'm your guy. I'll address them, and look forward to talking to you and maybe seeing you out in the field. Thanks so much, guys.
All right. Thanks again, Court. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.